Let's talk.
James Brown.
The Palmistry of Fingerprints explores the secret patterns hidden in your fingers and palms. It is by one of the foremost experts in the field, Christopher Jones, who has had a fascinating world a fascinating life in the world of palmistry for over 40 years. And I'm going to get this completely wrong, but you were secretary of the UK. How do you pronounce that? Is it Chirological Society?
Chirological. Like chiropractor.
Like
chiropractic.
You see that?
Same word.
That's why you're the expert and I'm sitting here in the studio just talking to myself. Christopher, good morning to you, sir. Good morning from us. Good evening to you.
Good morning and good evening. Nice to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me along.
Now, you surprised me because you told me that you only said good evening. I thought, well, okay, fair enough. But you're over in New Zealand, I believe, today. Yeah.
I grew up in London, but I've been out in New Zealand for 25 years. So I came here and had a family here, and it's a fantastic place to live. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's not quite so mad over here as it is in other parts of the world.
Yes, indeed. Right then, let's move. Well, we won't mention anything to do with rugby. Let's move swiftly onwards then, shall we? For those, a lot of people would say, it's Monday morning. Are we going down this whole ubbly-jubbly tarot reading? What's your aura like? You know, you've got your chakras in line, etc. Let's blow this out of the water straight off, shall we? Explain why modern hand reading is a valuable tool, both personally and on a wider scale, as it were.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's nice that you mention all those other wonderful practices, but actually they're nothing to do with hand reading whatsoever. People do associate those things together quite clearly. They are considered to be connected, and in fact, palmistry, as it's been practiced in India and in Europe going back hundreds of years, is often totally associated with astrology. But that's kind of like a legacy view, and I think there are people who are perpetuating that approach to hand reading, but their understanding of hand reading is about at least 200 years out of date, if not 500 years out of date. And modern hand reading emphasizes much more the fingerprint patterns than it does any kind of spurious association to planets or symbolism to do with the connection between the heavens and the earth. So they had this motif of like as above, so below. Yeah. Modern hand reading is much more sort of biologically represented by looking at the fingerprint patterns, simply because the fingerprint patterns are the most important, unique identifiers of each of us as individuals. And this is not something that's in dispute. Everybody knows they have a unique fingerprint pattern. There are no two fingerprint patterns that are alike. Even identical twins don't have identical fingerprint patterns, even if they look alike in every other way. And so effectively there are 80 billion unique fingerprint patterns on the planet, which is quite a lot. But we know that they are unique, and we know that fingerprint patterns are genetically determined because there's been about 120 years of medical research into fingerprint patterns and their medical and genetic significance. And so particular patterns are associated with dispositions to particular disease conditions. And it's also known that the fingerprint patterns don't change over time. And that's a kind of a key thing that's really, really important, because they don't change over time that they can be used for identification purposes. So just in a nutshell, you've got three things that say something important about the fingerprints are saying something really important. They say something about your genetic material. They say something that is unique to you. And they say something about your identity over time. And that's the basis upon which modern hand reading rests.
And when you say genetic, I mean, so are we talking? Explain what you mean by genetics. Is it if you are, I don't know, if you're Slavic, if you're Caucasian, if you are from another part of the world? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Genetics? Are there different fingerprints?
Okay, that's a slightly different question. That's an anthropological question.
Right.
I mean, that was of interest and of concern to people in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century. So if you look at the medical scientific literature into fingerprint patterns, one of the things that they were looking at was this idea of the distributions of different fingerprint patterns amongst different peoples around the world. So there were a lot of anthropological studies of fingerprint patterns, and in fact, you do find different distributions of fingerprint patterns amongst different types of people. However, there are 7 main fingerprint pattern types, and they occur on all people from all cultures in all parts of the world. They just occur in slightly different distributions, and that is significant. But that's not what I meant by genetics. What I meant by genetics was, if you, for example, look at the fingerprint patterns that in a family.
Yeah.
Say you have a whorl pattern. If you have an abundance of whorl patterns in your hand, it's very likely that one of your parents will have whorls and their grandparents will have whorls. Or if you have the loop pattern dominant in your hand, another member of your family will have the loop. So you can trace fingerprint patterns down through families exactly the same way you can do eye color or hair color. And so other physical characteristics. We always say, oh, you look just like your mum.
Yeah.
Oh, look, you're just like your dad. That kind of thing. But that actually replicates in the fingerprint patterns as well. So that's what I mean by genetics. So there's an inherited quality to the fingerprint patterns, which, as you quite rightly observe, does actually pan out in different cultures from different peoples around the world. And that's why it was of interest to anthropologists in the 1920s and 1930s in particular.
And we say that they don't change. I mean, you said that, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but your fingerprints do not change during... everybody now will be looking at their hands, listening to this, because you can't help yourself to look at your hands. But
no, exactly.
Presumably because we change our skin every 7 years, don't we? We reinvent ourselves every 7 years.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's true. But the patterns themselves are unchanging throughout life. What's probably more important to understand that is that the fingerprint patterns form in the hand of the fetus around the 16th week of gestation. So they're actually forming on the hand as the hand develops. So between the 16th and 24th week of gestation, between the 4th and 6th months of fetal life, that's when the fingerprint patterns, and not just the fingerprint patterns, because you've got toe prints as well, and you've also got patterns in the palm. If you look at your own hands right now, and if you just feel the hand, you'll feel that the skin on the surface of your palm is quite different from the skin everywhere else. It's kind of ridgy or grainy, and it's that grain which is what we call the dermatoglyphic. So that's the proper sort of medical term for skin ridges, is dermaglyphs.
Right.
Glyphs like hieroglyphics of the derma, skin, so skin carvings. And that skin ridges actually occur over the surface of the entire palm, and they make particular patterns, sometimes in the palm itself, but always on the fingerprints. So every finger has a unique pattern, and you may not have the same fingerprint pattern on each finger. You could have any one of the 7 main or 3 minor fingerprint patterns on any of the fingers, and there's distributions that are really important to consider as well. But they are formed in the womb, and it was about 1890 that it was discovered that they didn't change. There was Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, is the foremost pioneer of the study of fingerprint patterns, and him and a guy called William Herschel established over a 30-year period that the fingerprint patterns didn't change. And because they didn't change, and because they're unique, they were the people who offered it to the police forces, which is Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard adopted it as an identification process for identification purposes in 1901. So it's relatively late that fingerprint patterns were assessed and worked out. Having said that, the police themselves didn't exist before about 1840. So it's only 60 years later they figured out about fingerprints. But yeah, it's around that time that the police forces around the world start taking fingerprint patterns, and it's a good job that they don't change. Otherwise, these days, you'd walk through an airport and you'd be kind of accused of being a different person, or you'd lock your phone with your thumbprint, and then next week you couldn't open it again because your fingerprint had changed. So if you think about it, it's kind of like it's quite lucky that they don't change. But what that means is they don't change throughout your life. You're born with your fingerprint patterns, and they stay there right through to your end of days. So they literally are a unique biometric marker of your identity throughout the course of your life.
You said there are 7 main... Are there 7 main types? I hadn't thought about it. So there are 7... You said, was it whorls? And explain that. And then 3 subsections. The 3 main fingerprint... Yeah. The stats gets a bit technical, but I'll just do it simply.
Please do. There are 3 main fingerprint patterns: loops, whorls, and arches. So loops look like a wave. They're like a wave-shaped pattern. Yeah. The whorl is like a spiral or a target. And the arch is like a little humpback bridge. If you imagine those road signs with humpback bridges, it looks exactly like one of those. And those 3 are the primary fingerprint patterns. Those are the 3 that Francis Galton assessed as being the primary fingerprint patterns back in 1892. Yep. And they make up about 85% of all the fingerprint patterns. So you've got 15%, which is all the others, and there are 4 more minor fingerprint patterns which take up about 14% of the rest of them, and that's called the radial loop, the tented arch, the double loop, and the peacock's eye or compound. So those 7 make up 99% of all the fingerprint patterns, and then there are a few really anomalous ones that occur in like less than 0.5%, less than 0.25%, which occur occasionally. Kind of deviations from that, and there are about 3 or 4 of those as well. So the classification system has got nothing to do with what I do as a chirologist. Yeah. It's everything to do with the forensic work of the FBI and the police forces around the world. And so that if you get a standard book like Fingerprint Identification, published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, which is from Frederick Cherrell, who was the guy who did fingerprinting at Scotland Yard in 1954, and that becomes like the standard book by which you identify these things. What they're interested in, of course, is just purely identification. What I'm interested in is what are the psychological significances of that? Because if it's true that the fingerprint patterns are unique to you, and if it's true that they're markers of your identity, what would be the implications of that if they say something about? Would they not say something about what is unique about you and what is uniquely you? That is what is your identity over time. That would be something that would be worth investigating, and that's what I spent 40 years of my life looking at.
So So if these are markers about your, and in a world where we are we're increasingly sort of bland, and if you like, all sort of listening to the same music and drinking the same Costa coffees and eating the same sort of restaurants, no matter whether you're in. If
that's your unfortunate choice of life,
yes, indeed,
you have that choice. You don't have to do that. Of course, but you could go and live in New Zealand or Spain rather than living in South London.
Well, this is true, but it's all I always call it the blandification or the Dubaiification of the universe. But but. So presumably then...
Well, chirology is simply the antidote to blandification. I've never heard that word before, but it's absolutely the antidote to that. Because essentially, what chirology looks at is like, what is it to be you?
Yeah.
What is it is uniquely you? What is it that you have? What characteristics, what drives, what skills, what abilities, what talents do you have that other people don't have? And that's what's extraordinary about the fingerprint patterns. So if you start looking at really famous people... let's just take a couple of really well-known examples. I don't know if you've heard of Jimi Hendrix, but he's quite famous.
Occasionally, yes.
You've heard of him, right? Well, he's got extraordinarily rare combination of fingerprint patterns on his hand that are found in the hands of less than 1% of people. You look at the hands of John Lennon. He's got the same fingerprint pattern on his index finger that Jimi Hendrix has as well. Again, to the very rare degree of less than 1%. If you start looking at people who we have no question about, they have talents or skills or abilities, we understand that their unique contribution to culture or to history. When you start looking at those fingerprint patterns, you see they have really interestingly diverse, unique combinations of fingerprint patterns that very, very few other people have. There's a colleague of mine in America called Andreas Washington. And he's been doing what I've been doing, but completely in a parallel track in a parallel universe for the last 45 years. He's formerly a corrections officer, so he's kind of coming in from that point of view.
Okay.
But he's come up with the same conclusions as I have, that the uniqueness of your fingerprint patterns will show what is unique about you. And so if we can decipher what they are, we can work out what we've got and the combination that we have, then that will tell us something about our unique gifts, skills and talents and orientations. So, on that particular point, in the book, in the Palmistry of Fingerprint Patterns, I've actually got a chapter on Hendrix, and I've got a chapter on John Lennon, and I've also got one on Malcolm X as well, just a few examples of famous people with unusual fingerprint patterns that, arguably and demonstrably have had interesting and unusual lives. And there is a correlation, there's a statistical correlation between the uniqueness of these fingerprint patterns and the uniqueness of the lifestyle they've created. Now, I'm not a statistician, but this guy, Andreas Washington, is.
Yeah.
And that's why I've referenced him in my book, and he collaborated with me in certain parts of the book, because he's got a very unique statistical representation of that, and he's come to the same conclusions after 40 years as I have. So there's a nice convergence of ideas.
But what we're saying here is, it's not as if you've got the same loop or whirl or humpback bridge or whatever it is as Hendrix and Lennon had. They had the same thing, or are you predestined to to play blinding guitar solos, or alternatively, if you have something else, you're going to be you're going to be a civil rights firebrand. Are we talking? I mean, they don't. No one fingerprint says, okay, you're going to be a musician, you're going to be a civil rights leader. No, we're not talking about.
No, but it's about what is your unique contribution, and I take it wider than that. That's a particular thing that Andrus does, but I take it wider than that because I'm looking at the whole hand. I also look at the lines and look at the fingers and I look at the thumbs and everything else as well. But so the context of the hand is really important from the point of view of understanding the significance of the fingerprint patterns. But what you can see in the fingerprint patterns is what I call the motivational dispositions. They're like sort of forces that live within us that kind of impel us in a particular direction. They give us particular dispositions to certain kind of experiences, certain kind of behaviors, and so on and so on. So, for example, John Lennon's sarcasm is a kind of reflection of one of his fingerprint patterns. That basically he had a very sort of fragile, brittle ego, and he was very defensive about that. And you can understand that by understanding what the forces were within him, and that's actually described by one of the fingerprint patterns that he has. Whereas Hendrix again is a different character. Again, Hendrix is. People always say how original Hendrix is. I mean, I beg to differ. If you think about Hendrix, what he is essentially he's a mimic, and he basically. Have you ever seen him playing in the backing band for the Isley Brothers?
I know.
If you've never seen a video of him doing that, you should watch it because he's wearing a suit, like a sort of blue kind of frilly shirted suit, and he's sort of swaying and walking backwards and forwards, in a sort of rock and roll kind of way. And, which is a completely different image of him than we will have in our minds of what Hendrix looks like. But he was somebody who was very, very good at assimilating different styles of music and then producing it in its own unique and original way. And the fingerprint he has on his hand is called a radial peacock's eye. Yeah. And that is probably the most rare fingerprint pattern of all. And that's on his left index finger, which of course is important because he's left-handed.
Exactly,
so you need a dominant hand, that matters too. But he's much of what his brilliance is the ability to innovate based upon things that he's internalized. And so he kind of chameleonized. I think I look at Hendrix and say he chameleonized the zeitgeist.
But you see, if you think about it, the two things that Hendrix is best known for are All Along the Watchtower, Dylan track, and Star Spangled Banner. You rest your case.
Absolutely, he didn't exactly. He's or Hey Joe, he didn't write that either. Yeah. It's like all these songs that he just turned into a different kind of way. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that he does that, and it's like, but it's in that's reflected in this particular pattern he has, which is for those who know about fingerprints, and there might be some. It's a radial loop with a whirl inside it, so it's a kind of combination of two of the patterns together, which is an extraordinary rare combo. So we look for these anomalies, if you like. So the anomalies in our fingerprint patterns kind of show the anomaly of who we are. And you're quite right, the blandification and the politics of society kind of tries to make people conform into a particular mold. And if you're somebody who's got 9 or 10 ulnar loops, you'll probably be quite happy going along with the crowd. If you're somebody that doesn't have the normative fingerprint pattern, you're going to feel like you don't fit in. And so understanding your fingerprints can understand why you feel different and understand what your motivations are that are different from other people, and give you some clues as to how you should best express your life. Yeah. I mean, again, Lennon, he had 5 whirl fingerprint patterns, so that was the instinctively rebellious side that he had in him. Loops are conformists, and people with loops do things in groups. People with whirls are more individual and want to do things their own way and want to break the rules. And so this sort of tension that we all have, and is felt within us all, but it's kind of reflected by the balance of loops and whirls. The more whirls you've got, the more you're going to want to break free of that blandification process. That's for sure.
Presumably, this is written though because people will say, "Oh, well, I want to see my lifeline. I'm going to make it through the next Thursday." But presumably, this is a jumping off point, is it? So you can say, "Look, look, if you look at the whirls and loops or whatever, you have this talent. You have the rainbow peacock thing. Go ahead and use it." And this is so it's not saying you're not going to open this book and say, "I'm not going to make it till March." I might as well give up.
No, exactly. No, that's a really good point. And that we're in the Palmistry of Fingerprint Patterns. Well, the first chapter in the book, I emphasise this point because people think about hand reading, they think about the lines.
Yeah.
And what I point out in the book is that the lines of the hand change over time. So there's in the first section you've got pictures of the lines that I don't know if you got sent a PDF, but you can see the lines of the hands changing.
Yeah.
And when the lines of the hands change over time, what you realise is that the lines are not indicators of fate or fortune or anything else. And so what I'm trying to emphasize with the book, I say, well, there are two things we can look at, and we can look at the lines and we can look at the fingerprint patterns. Which one's more fundamental? Now, if the lines change, and they can change to do with things like your health and your illness. They can change with things like pregnancy. They can change with things like hormonal changes. I mean, in my life, I've seen the number of lines on my hands come and go as I've been more or less stressed in my life. So stress, worry, anxiety, hormonal changes, endocrinological changes, they can all affect the lineation on the hand. And the lines can come and go. Some lines appear, some lines disappear, lines get longer, lines get shorter. The lines kind of change according to our experiences in the world.
Okay.
But the fingerprint patterns stay constant. So the kind of fingerprints are like markers of a fundamental quality of your identity.
So you basically, mind officially blown, Christopher. So your fingerprints don't move, yet your palm is an indication, it's a weather vane of what you're going through at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's a really good way of putting it. And in the book, I've got two handprint examples of a young man who changed his life radically between the ages of 26 and 39. So a 13-year age difference. And then another pair of handprints from a guy whose handprints were taken in 1959 and then 1949. No, 1950 and 1991, so that's a 41-year age difference. And in that particular case, you can see, for example, the effects of aging. So he's 70 when the handprint was taken. And one of the things that happens, obviously, when we get older is, we become less well, and you can see the effects of the illness that's happening in his hands. But, the hands change according to the situations and circumstances of our lives, but they also change according to our decisions about how we want to lead our lives and the kind of things that we do. So in one case, he was a bricklayer who became a Buddhist monk, and he wrote 30 books. And so you've got the handprint changing from like an ordinary fud from South London into a self-confessed academic, and so you get the lineation that changes in accordance with that. So the lines come and go. Yeah, that's what's interesting about them.
But you see, you still talk about things about that, about. It's not all written out for us. The bricklayer who became a Buddha. I mean, that should be, that's a novel in its heart in itself. But so it's not all, that's
another good story.
Yeah. It's not all it's not all predetermined, because I can't do anything until my angel tells me something or something, and it's like, no.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that kind of philosophy. I think it's a bit fatalistic. I think life is a kind of balance of nature and nurture. We're given certain gifts. You look the way you look because you're the offspring of your parents, and you don't look like Joe Nalomo or something out of the All Blacks from Tonga. You just don't look like that, and it would be very weird if your mum and dad.
It's the light, I tell you. It's the light in the studio, mate. I tell you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but equally, you have something of the psychology of your parents, and you have something of the intellectual capacity of your parents, so that all those kind of things we understand to be inherited. But then what you do with that, it depends on what life experiences you've had. Yeah. And so I think that's a nice way of thinking about the fingerprints and the lines is, the fingerprints are like what you've kind of inherited and what kind of characteristics come through you, and then the line formations can indicate the kind of changes. I'll give you an example, because this is quite good. I can do this. I know your people can't see, but if you look at the lines of my hand, you can probably see that line there is really straight. Can you see that one?
Got you on that one. Yeah.
But if you look at the same on the other hand, can you see it's really kind of
you've got a chicane.
Curvy?
You've got a chicane, as we say. Yeah.
All right. So this is my left hand, and I'm right-handed.
Yeah.
But this line here looks exactly the same as the same line on my dad's hand.
Okay.
And then this line is completely different. So that's a kind of reflection of what kind of capabilities I've inherited from my father. He was a management consultant. He had a PhD. He was quite academic. And then what I've done with it is something a bit more weird and a bit more different. So because my airline has changed.
Hence the chicane. Yeah.
So you can see that you can see the difference between those two things. And it's the same if you look at the hands of identical twins. If you remember, I mentioned earlier, I said in identical twins, they don't have identical fingerprints. They usually have 9 fingerprints the same, and then 1 that's different. That's what I've observed. I've seen about a dozen identical twins over the years. It's quite hard to find identical twins, because normally when you find one, you haven't got the other one. They live in Toronto or something.
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult to get them both together. But when you do, I always say to all hand readers, if you find a pair of identical twins, offer them a free hand reading so you can get their prints. But every time I see identical twins, what's notable is that the lines are very different. And so what you can see there is the differences in their personality and the differences in their temperament, which they will know, but even though they look physically the same.
Yeah.
So the genetics, the hand shape, the fingerprints will be the same or more or less the same. You know, one might have a freckle here and the other one doesn't.
Yeah.
There may be some slight difference, but for all intents and purposes. But what you also know is they have slightly different habits, or they think slightly differently, or have slightly different views. You know,
yes.
One might vote Tory, one might vote Labour, whatever it is. You know, and so, but that will be reflected in the way that their lines form in the hand. So you get this kind of nature and nurture part of it, and so it's not a prediction in that sense. But like everything else in life, the choices that we make are only going to be as good as the information that we have. And if we're going to make choices about ourselves and the direction in life that we're going to go in, how about we make an informed choice about who we are and what we are and where we should go? And, you know, and let me tell you something that I think is really good on this point. I mean, I love reading the hands of like 19 to 27-year-olds because people at that age, they're young and they're kind of like they're unformed and they don't quite know what they're doing. And they've got the whole life ahead of them and they're pissing about on traveling around the world. And they haven't, you know, did they finish their degree, whatever. They're not quite sure what they're doing. You can give them some really good, concrete vocational guidance at that age. You know, the kind of skill sets they've got, or the kind of jobs they go in, the kind of things that they might enjoy doing. And then you can see that quite clearly from the hand. And that's great. But what's more interesting is when you read the hands of 55, 60-year-olds.
Yes.
And of course, you know, when you read that, you're doing a retrospective and you say, well, this is what your life was. And this is the kind of job that you did do. And they go, oh, my God, it's amazing. How did you know all of that? And always, without fail, whenever I read the hand of anybody who's over 50, they always say, oh, my God, I wish someone had told me this 30 years ago.
Because
without fail,
because
if they'd had that information when they were 25 as opposed to 55, they would have made better life choices and better life decisions. Because your decisions are only as good as your self-knowledge and your self-awareness. Now, we can all learn about ourselves, and we will have lots of shitty life experiences. It was a terrible relationship, but I learned a lot about myself. It was a horrible job, but I did learn. Well, at least I learned what I didn't like doing. We learn the hard way. We learn through experience. But actually, we don't have to learn through experience. We can learn through insight. And the hand is a really powerful tool for developing self-understanding and self-awareness.
The book. Occasionally I go into an interview and I think, yeah, okay, you know, I'll be done and dusted. It'll be 10 minutes. We'll talk about, you know, here we go. It'll be all fluffy and you'll have a zodiac sign behind. This has been absolutely mind blowing. Chris, the book is called The Palmistry of Fingerprints. It's by Christopher Jones, who we're talking to today. I can't stop looking at my hands now. Life choices. Christopher, if people want to find you online and find out more about the book, where's the best place to track you down and say wonderful things about you?
Thank you. My website will be a good place to start, www.handreading.nz.
Yeah.
That's pretty easy to remember if you can put the .nz on the end of it. I'm also part of an organisation called the International Hand Reading Association. That's website is handreadinginternational.com. That's a work that I'm doing with collaborating with other hand readers that I've known for 30, 40 years. And we run annual conferences. Twice a year we run conferences, and we teach people how to read hands. So that's worldwide, that is.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I honestly completely changed I'm not going to be looking at my hands all day now. Great stuff indeed. The book is called The Palmistry of Fingerprints. It's by Christopher Jones. Christopher, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me on your show. It's been a pleasure.